Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Thunder, and this is Tenor Talks with Dr. Thunder and Dr. Robert Brooks. And so we are continuing on the equipment topic. Does equipment really matter? Does equipment really matter? And make sure you go back and check out the first two episodes. We're going to try not to repeat ourselves, but I'm sure that there will be a little bit of repetition. That is sort of the nature of things, kind of to get us up to speed. We're going to try to focus a little bit more on doubles, setups for doubles. But then I also have a new instrument that a number of my students have played, that my colleague here, Dr. Robert Brooks, played, that I've, of course, have played. And we'll talk a little bit about that instrument, the manufacturer, and some of our thoughts on the instrument. And I also want to talk on this topic. So one of the challenges with advancing technology, especially with musical instruments, we'll say, is that saxophones inherently do not play in tune. Historically, they have not played in tune. The problem with fixing that problem, fixing the intonation issue, or fixing other mechanical issues with the instrument, is that people have spent, buku hours developing the ability to play in tune on an instrument that does not. So if you give them something that plays well in tune and has fixed all of the usual issues with the instrument, you may have an issue selling that instrument because people will think that there's something wrong with it. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. That's kind of an interesting point. So you know how we do it. Tenor Talks. Let's go. What's happening?
How you doing?
Doing all right. Doing all right. So,
Good.
uh, uh, this is the third part in this "Does Equipment Really Matter" series,
Mhm.
and uh, I wanted to try to focus a little bit on doubles. Also, talk about this instrument that this new instrument that I have uh, that you've played and a number of our students have
Mhm.
played, and of course that I've played, and then talk about maybe the perceived problem of advancing technology with respect to an established market. Can
Yeah.
how hard can you push the market? To get to the next thing. Where's the sort of kind of sweet spot? And there's been a lot of advancement in the development of the saxophone, the technology of the saxophone, but it seems to me that many of the issues that the saxophone actually has have already been fixed, but we just don't want those instruments.
Mhm.
So, so let's talk
Yeah.
about doubles. So
I,
what is your setup? What is your
yeah,
setup on
sure.
your doubles? And yeah, oops,
So I don't actually have for flute. I just have just a completely stock kind of intermediate Yamaha. I think it's a 461 flute. Really, really nice instrument. It does what I need it to do. But I don't have anything too crazy in terms of some of the accessories or things that you can kind of get. I know some people get into kind of like on saxophone where we talk about getting a different neck. I use, I know we talked about that where I have a special neck on my tenor, and I have a silver plated Selmer neck on my alto. You can get solid silver head joints. You can get the gold lips, and there's other kind of innovations and things with that. I know they also will do some of the head joint weights, kind of like what we talked about last time about on the neck joint for saxophone. So I don't really have much experience personally with those things. On clarinet, a little bit different. So I uh, I use a vintage Buffet R13 B flat clarinet. I have a Van Doren M30 lyre facing mouthpiece for that. I use a Buffet Hadash barrel, which is a slightly different kind of shape and the inside of what's going on. I don't know if I'm educated enough to know what that shape is.
mm,
I just know that I like it. I think it sounds, I like the tone, I like the response better. And I've played a good amount of barrels, and it seems like the barrel and the bell on clarinet are the things that kind of in that order are kind of some of the other equipment accessories. I've seen people with, barrels that are synthetic, that don't have rings. I play with somebody that uses a Bakun barrel that doesn't have tenon rings, and that changes how it sounds. And same thing with the bell. I think we last time we talked a little bit about the thumb, specialized thumb thing that I use, and there's certainly a lot of other stuff. I think in a lot of ways, pad material can also make a big difference um, on clarinet. More, my opinion, more so than on saxophone. On saxophone, I know we talk about leather pads, or you get like rue pads or something. And
right.
on clarinet, because there are so many, because there's a lot higher pressure of an instrument, and it's a lot easier for tone because of the smaller tone holes. It's a lot easier for those tone holes to get waterlogged. Different materials can have a different, and obviously the clarinet doesn't use resonators, so because of that, there's a little bit different that way. Um, but yeah, so I've experimented with some of that stuff, but not nearly as much. I like with all of my instruments, I use Silverstein ligatures. And last time we talked about those synthetic reeds that Silverstein sent me. the Ambipoly reed, and they sent me B flat clarinet reeds in two different cuts. Actually, they have a Vivace and a Primo. And generally speaking, from what they said, but also kind of my own experience, Vivace is kind of somewhere in between like a V12 and like a Rue 56, like a German cut.
Mm.
And then the Primo is like a traditional, like a blue box Van Duren reed. Both are really good. I like the Vivace better. Um, I was using the Leger European 3.5, and I'm using a Silverstein Vivace 3 3/4, or what they call 3.5 plus. And it's I think the sound is more resonant and the articulation's a lot easier. And that was probably the only thing. And I kind of think that's true. Be interested in getting your take just on the Leger reeds in general. That the articulation seems a little bit. I have to be a little harsher. I feel like maybe that's just a perception thing because obviously with a cane reed it would change. But that's kind of my take on that stuff. But that's what I use. So
Yeah, yeah, okay. I'm on clarinet. I'm also using an M30 Profile 88 um, mouthpiece, and that came uh, recommended by the professor of clarinet at Ohio State. Um, and so, yeah, she suggested that it was, yeah. I was playing prior to that. I was playing on a Pine mouthpiece, and he was a former professor of clarinet uh,
mhm.
at at Ohio State, and he came by my office and he gave me this thing. It had like four mouthpieces in it. And, he said, "Well, play these and keep the one that you like." And
Yeah.
especially then, I was looking for the most sort of free blowing kind of option, and so I picked one, and I was still playing on like fibrocell reeds, um, and so that was a different calculus for what the strength was and for what it was that I was trying to go for. Since then, I'm not. I mean, I don't want to be. I don't want my head to blow up when I'm playing clarinet, but um, I'm not as concerned about this sort of free blowing thing. Um, and I've sort of
Mhm.
accepted that an aspect of the back pressure is somewhat associated with this sort of darkness of the sound. So there's sort of an exchange, and because of the different angle that you are supposed to play with clarinet versus
Mhm.
what you'd play with saxophone as far as the angle of the mouthpiece coming out, it already sort of sets up a less of a quote unquote what we'd call free blowing sort of experience. So some of that I've sort of accepted as just this is just what it's going to be. Now, as far as barrels, I've tried a number of barrels and used a number of barrels, and I think when I was playing on stuff that was more free blowing, the net effect was a lower pitch coming out of the mouthpiece. And so, because there was a lower pitch coming out of the mouthpiece, I tended to need a shorter barrel. And so,
Mhm.
there's I think it was Rico that made click barrel, and it's a plastic a barrel, and they call it a click barrel because it clicks as you're making it longer or making it shorter. And I played on that because it would go all the way down to like 62,
Mhm.
and at that time I needed something that was that short so that I could play in tune because of the low pitch coming out of the mouthpiece. Now the barrel that I play on now is like a 64 or 65, and it's not an adjustable barrel; it's a pine barrel. Um, and prior to that, because my click barrel broke finally after years and years of playing on it, so I found that I think it's what is it, Berkeley? What? what's the name of the company? Something Berkeley.
I don't know.
I can't think of the name right now. But they made an aluminum barrel that
Hmm.
is adjustable. It can get longer and can get shorter. And initially, when I started playing on that, it was great. It sort of was kind of substituting, and then as I stopped needing a barrel that was so long, I'm sorry, that was so short, I could kind of um, adjust it to what I needed. But then I started having significant issues with its sealing because the way that it actually gets
Oh.
longer, there's threads and there's this oil and stuff and there's these rubber seals and all this kind of stuff. And so I started having an issue with it not sealing, and it took me a long time to accept that it was the barrel and not me, because I thought it was me. I was like, oh man, it's like what is going on? Why am I having such an issue? No, it was the barrel. I switched to just the barrel that came with the instrument, and I stopped having those issues. Um, so anyhow, but that's part of the reason I switched back to the pine barrel, and when I moved to the M30 Profile 88 mouthpiece, and then I was playing on, and now I play on Leger European cut reeds,
Hmm.
still a Francois Louis Ultimate Ligature. When I moved to that mouthpiece in that reed, the pitch that's coming out of the mouthpiece is higher, so I no longer needed a barrel that was shorter. So that's a
Hmm.
long and short of it. Sort of my evolution in sort of clarinet setups. I can't even remember what the initial mouthpieces I was playing on. I was playing on something that, like, when I started playing clarinet, I was like 16, and
Hmm.
I didn't really know anything about it. I just picked something that felt like saxophone. So it was just like something that was super bright. It was not good. Um, and so it took me a while to sort of change my sort of conception and kind of get that together. But anyhow, so that's sort of the deal with that. My flute is a KG Limited. It's a handmade Gemeinhardt flute. Um, Not one of the production models. I have one of the production models. I think it's a what is it? Um, what is it? 3SP, and it's not plated. So it must be a 3SB. It must be a 3SB. B for a B foot, and it's solid silver. That's the production model that I have. That one stays in my office, and it is inline. I like inline flutes, not offset. And then my handmade KG Limited, and I have an assortment of different head joints and stuff with that. I've had that flute for 20 some years.
Hmm.
That is my that's my primary flute. Um, and yeah, I mean it's Gemeinhardt is the world's largest, biggest producer of flutes. Um, they make the most flutes. They sell the most flutes. Um, and I've been with Gemeinhardt for 25 years or something, for a long time. They've always treated me well, and um, all the instruments that I have are somehow related to Gemeinhardt.
Hmm. I wanted to kind of go back to some of the clarinet stuff because I thought that was interesting, partly because my dissertation is written on doubling, clarinet doubling specifically, starting on saxophone and moving to clarinet. And regarding equipment, I think it's an easy pitfall. Exactly what you said. I was looking for something that felt like saxophone,
Yep.
and I have a section in that document talking about um, that you don't want to be fooled by how similar the two instruments seem. because it really is that, because we like to focus on, oh, well, the mouthpiece looks similar and it's a reed and the ligatures look similar and there's all this stuff that's similar. But the biggest difference, you're right, is the instrument angle and how that kind of shapes your embouchure and mouth. But on top of that, um, the instrument itself in terms of the bore. So part of that is obviously a smaller bore, but the unique thing with saxophone, and I try to talk about this a lot with my students, both here at the university or across the country that study with me, is that the saxophone is unique. And in wind instruments, it is the only one that is completely conical. And that's why there's such a focus on adjustment and voicing. And that's a part of the reason why, kind of maybe leading into the next thing we're going to talk about, why old models used to be so out of tune, because they were still figuring those things out. Because, you think about a flute is a completely cylindrical, a clarinet is effectively cylindrical. The barrel, has a little bit of a deviance in the shape, and the bell will flare. Though I found out recently, I have a older, pretty well loved Selmer bass clarinet, and I found that my low notes are actually more in tune without the bell on than with it on. That my lowest notes are a lot easier to play in tune without the bell. Unfortunately, I don't have a neck strap for it, so I have to have the bell so I can physically play. But that element specifically makes the saxophone very different than the clarinet. And so and I was told by my teacher when I was working on that stuff, when I was studying clarinet in grad school, was effectively the reminder of this is its own instrument. This is a unique thing. So don't try to get it to feel the same. Pressure is a part of that. A higher mouthpiece note is a part of that. Maybe the readiness or the brightness that you're going to hear as playing a soprano pitched instrument is a part of that. And that'll also, I think that leads sometimes for saxophonists to pick the wrong equipment. So they get a really big tip opening, they get a really, free brawling barrel, and it might be more comfortable in the short term, but I think it ultimately limits them, depending on what kind of music you're trying to play, right? A lot of my doubling experience is playing in pit orchestras. And that certainly has influences of many different styles depending on the show you're playing. But the core concept is classical music, right? There's an orchestral sound to that. And so I don't want to, I want to blend in and fit into that style. Because I think the first mouthpiece I had on clarinet was like a Van Doren jazz mouthpiece. I forget what the model was. Wasn't a B45, it was something even bigger than that. And it felt great. It felt a lot like playing alto. But I couldn't play in tune, and the sound wasn't right. It stuck out in an ensemble really badly. And so that's I think that's a good thing to kind of reiterate, and that where it comes from is important. And even some of our students that work on doubling with me here at Ohio State, I tell them about that. I'm like, so don't expect this to be like saxophone. Don't expect yourself to be good at this because you're good at saxophone, firstly, and expect that if anything that it should be harder because you're good at saxophone, because you have all of these habits and tendencies that are leading you to do things that might be wrong, that might be the wrong direction. And equipment the equipment you pick, I think can be a part of that feeling for sure.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I just
So
wanted to add that in there.
yeah, it's interesting. Similar path. As far as like
Yeah.
picking something that, hey, this feels like saxophone, I can get with it, and then realizing that, wait a minute, this shouldn't feel like saxophone. This is clarinet. In
Yeah.
my talking to students, teaching students with the doubling thing, that's something that I talk about frequently. It may seem like the upper range of the clarinet is like soprano saxophone, and the bottom range below the break is like alto saxophone. But that's not a good way to think about it because that's
Yeah.
going to lead you astray. Uh, um,
Hmm.
so you really want to treat it like it's a separate instrument. And of course, uh, music lovers, people that don't play instruments but that love music, when you have that sort of conversation, when they say, well, those seem like they're similar. Are they the same? It's like, well, not really. Um,
Yeah.
somebody at the last concert I played with the CJO, and they were like, "What is that big black saxophone?" It's like, well, that's a bass clarinet. That's not really a saxophone. Was it like saxophone? No, not really. I mean, the range of it, I suppose you could say, is somewhat similar, but no. Basically, the answer is no. It's not. And I would screw myself up trying to think. Okay, let me pick up this black saxophone and start playing. That wouldn't be a good experience. So
Oh yeah. Hmm.
yeah, and my setup is totally different, and my expectation for mouthpiece pitch, and all of that. I mean, I've got like this huge um, um, tip opening on my Berry. I'm playing on a uh, on a B9, the
Mm.
hard rubber Van Doren V16 B9, with like a, what is it, like a three, playing like a three, um, Leger, Leger, actually a Leger American cut, because they finally started making American cut for Barry.
Oh,
Um, and that's actually like a within the last couple months I got that read, and
yeah. I
so
didn't know
it's
they
like,
made it an American bear. Yeah.
yeah. That was one thing I was like, when are they going to start doing this? Because I was still playing on the signature, which was still fine. It was still great, but you get greedy, and I'm like, man, but it would be even better if whatever. So, yeah, so it's not the same. Now, with with respect to flute, I wanted to mention this. Um, Now I have an issue with my left wrist, and um, I've figured out how to do everything that I need to do, and I can do it for a long time. And I may get a little stiffness and a little soreness, but it's totally fine. But with the flute, I cannot play flute very long. Not anymore. I can play it for, um, you know, I played on the gig, or I practice. I have to really be very particular about how long I play the flute, which is frustrating, but which is reality. This is just what it is. Because when you hold the flute, it causes you to hold it in a really awkward, contort. I mean, there's not really a good way to hold the instrument with your left hand. At least the way that I play. Now, I would be interested in some sort of contraption that would allow me to be able to hold the flute without that break back, you know, my hand being backwards twisted like this when I play, which is what is really causes the issue with my wrist. Now, something that somebody was suggesting, which and they're not even a flute player or a saxophone player. They suggested something about uh, a different sort of head joint, and I was thinking about this. I wonder if there could be a head joint that was designed where the head joint caused it so that you could more or less hold the flute this way, which would not bother my wrist. But then there would be a turn in the so the you know the head joint would come up, and then it would turn, so that I could still do what this would still be the same, but the angle that I approached that would be different. Or even if it could be turned a little bit, so that my wrist
Yeah.
again wouldn't have to be straight. So that's something. If there's a manufacturer out there or something seeing this, uh, I'm sure I'm not the only person that has a left wrist issue that's exacerbated by playing flute.
Well, something that I actually own, and I'm frantically looking around on my desk, and it must be at home, is I have a head joint, alternative head joint that's called a flip head, which is manufactured in Germany, and it does that. It turns the saxophone into the form factor of, turns a flute into the form factor of a saxophone. So you play the instrument vertically in front of you. The
Mm-hmm.
only, and it has a bend in the neck. The issue is it has a recorder style mouthpiece. So it's not the split tone mouthpiece. So it gets you that comfortability here. Um, and the recorder style mouthpiece is good in a lot of ways because it's very consistent. You know, embouchure is far less of a factor on a recorder than it is on any other wind instrument. It's very loose, it's very relaxed. Um, the issue that I noticed with that, and I was, you know, on my own, I was playing it and it was a lot of fun. But then I tried to play it in an ensemble and I could not play in tune. I couldn't, there's no flexibility in terms of adjusting the pitch, or very, very limited in terms of adjusting pitch.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really difficult. And I effectively had a very limited range of the flute that would play in tune. And it's also because I can't focus and change, you know, do the slight changes in terms of focus and direction in my air. I really couldn't play much higher than like a D above the staff. So it certainly had some flaws, but that product does exist in terms of having the form factor. But I agree, having it come with a normal head joint. So you're
Mm-hmm.
playing, even if it was something, it probably would have to be a pretty short head joint.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the total length, but
Even
I think that'd be great. I'd love to try it.
and this is interesting too because I thought about this because I have I've got well I've owned a couple different alto flutes. The alto flute now that I have is the one that I had when I was a kid, and it's not sitting up in here. I actually played it with uh, Maria Schneider. She likes to have all kind of weird stuff. So so I played alto flute. Actually, I wasn't the only person in the saxophone section playing alto flute. Okay, so
Wow.
there you go. Um, uh, but alto flute also has the option of like a uh, what is it, the curved the curved
Yeah, like a
head
U.
joint. Yeah, so that tells you that there's the technology seems like it would exist, or it does exist, to be able to do what it is that I'm saying. Now, obviously the how short it would be pretty short because a flute's head joint is pretty short compared to alto flute, so you'd have less real estate to work with. But even if even if you didn't get a full sort of a full like L shape so that you could be straight, even if it was so that you could
Mm-hmm.
play it this way, that still would solve that issue
Yeah.
for my flute, for my wrist. So
I wonder, you know, kind of similar with, you talked about that you don't like an offset, or you like an inline, you don't like the offset and stuff.
right,
And maybe this kind of can lead us into talking about this new alto that you have. I think that's an example of
I'm
the
gonna grab the alto.
hardcore
Keep
flute.
going.
Sure. I think that's an example of the hardcore flute community might not be interested in that innovation because they're used to playing the instrument in a certain form factor. And I kind of think about on saxophone a little bit like playing, like getting a straight alto, right? Or something like that. Maybe this leads me to this and that, maybe whatever. But ultimately, a lot of most professional saxophone players are going to be like, well, what's wrong with the way the horn is made now? And I would argue that a lot of professional primary instrument flute players who are have orchestra gigs or are teaching at major universities, probably to them it'd be like, oh, why would I do that? It's totally fine in a certain way. And so then by virtue, major manufacturers aren't looking at that with as much, I don't want to say seriousness, but as much interest commercially, because they're having to.
It's probably not going to be viable in the market. That's the
Yeah,
problem.
exactly, because it
Yeah, yeah.
turns, yeah, exactly. So I wonder how much of that. That's kind of what I was surprised about with that flip head, because it's very much a novelty. Um, and luckily, I was able to contact that person, and uh, fortunate not to have to be able not to have to pay full price for that. But I think the retail price for one of those head joints is like $250, and it's like, man, it's a lot of money for like a head joint to turn my flute into a recorder. To have like a fully chromatic recorder. So I wonder if there's an element of that. But I think it would be good. Maybe we could maybe that's our $1 million idea, Dr. Wallace.
So,
Cool.
so here's the instrument. Now, okay, so before I talk about this instrument, um, you were saying the thing about inline versus offset or whatever, and I mentioned
Oh
that,
yeah.
and so actually now most of the flutes are actually offset, and it that wasn't the
Yeah, mine
case
is.
before, right? So that's one of those developments that happened over time.
Mhm.
Certainly, saxophone players, for instance, are probably going to tend to want to play on offset because the saxophone is offset, right? But the reason for offset is that this finger, the ring finger, is shorter
Mhm.
than the middle finger. At least for most people, it is shorter than this finger. So offset basically is almost just adjusting for where that finger comes. Now, so it's unusual for these days. It's unusual for people to actually favor in line like I do, but you know that's what I mean. My first flute was like a plateau keyed flute, and it was offset. But then after that, I started playing on inline stuff. All of the open hole stuff that I played on has been inline, and so that's just what I expect to do. Now, it probably is contributing to my wrist issue because I have to rotate my hand a little bit more to
Yeah.
get that finger to hit in the center of that key. But yeah, it's interesting. So um so here's the horn, and this is an Eastman. It's Eastman. Let's see if I can get. I don't know if we're gonna see. Well, you can kind of see. It's trained on my face, but anyhow, uh, okay, there we go. Eastman Andreas, Eastman Andreas, and the good people over at Eastman sent me this horn, which has some interesting features. It's got metal keys, right? But it's a different material than the sort of the stem or whatever of the keys, and it has a couple other things that are interesting. So like right here, it's kind of hard to see it, but on the C sharp key right here is really kind of a built up area, which sort of makes your finger have to kind of stay in there. It at least guides your finger, tells you, hey, that's the end. Don't move past there. And that has a good feel to it. It's unique, it's different. And then also this here is different. And this is the octave mechanism is very much different, you know. And it's raised, the octave key is raised, it's higher than the thumb the thumb rest, which makes it so that rather than that sort of um, pushing down from the thumb rest, you're actually pushing sideways. And when the octave key is
Mhm.
completely depressed, it's almost level with the the thumb rest. So that's a sort of interesting thing. it has these sort of built up. Let's see if I can. It's hard for me to tell what we're looking at, but right there, if you can see
Yeah.
these feet, I know it's kind of blurry and stuff because it's the I have the camera trained to look at my face, um, but you can see the feet there, right? And that's built up, and then you have the same sort of idea, the same sort of construction here. Let's see. With those feet, you can see those underneath this plate under there. You can see, right? Um, but really even over the range. At least that was my experience. Um, you played the horn also. Why don't you talk about your experience with it?
Yeah, I thought it sounded really good. I thought it felt pretty uh, pretty consistent.
Yeah,
I noticed it feels very resonant, that it was really free blowing throughout the whole range. And I think this might be something that we kind of get into, but there's always this kind of illusion of, well, it's not what I'm used to doing. I've put in so many hours on a specific saxophone or even a specific brand.
yep,
And so some of that stuff, it's easy to interpret something as different as bad immediately. And I noticed that some of the responsive wasn't what I was predicting, but I think a hallmark of any great musician, and whatever we're talking about is adaptability. Um, but I was really impressed with that. I thought right, I'm from, had never played it before. It was really consistent in terms of tone and register. It felt, I think there's kind of sometimes a balance with how much focus do you want in a sound, and I think that's something that I like about the horns that I play. So my alto is Super Action 80 or a Selmer Series 1. So, they obviously, when they made it, it wasn't Series 1, but I think that is a little bit more focused of a horn, but it's kind of good because I can do classical or jazz on it. Some horns I've played are way too unfocused or too focused, which kind of leads it to sound a little dead. And I thought that was a really, really good balance. I liked the feel, a couple things. I think setup wise would be a little bit different for me. I really like the metal keys. I didn't realize that was going to make as much of a difference as I thought. And some of the newer instruments that I've played, I don't necessarily love the key work. Was a little uncomfortable in terms of just the position of keys,
mm-hmm.
not necessarily just their shape. And I liked that about this saxophone, that I thought the positioning of all the keys felt very comfortable, and honestly reminded me of my alto in some ways, just a little bit more um, balanced, maybe a balance of kind of that like modern keywork, modern ergonomics, and kind of some of the vintage stuff. Felt like it played in tune. Altissimos seemed to speak well. Um, and yeah, especially, I haven't played many. I've never, that was the only Eastman alto I've ever played. I've played a couple
Mm,
of their tenors, and I don't know, which models or anything. And they were fine, but that's certainly the best Eastman saxophone I've played. And it's one of those things where, um, try go out of my way to try instruments. I think it's important to, especially as educators, to be aware of technology and things, because when I have students in my office and they ask about a brand of mouthpiece or reeds or a saxophone, that's an opportunity for me to guide them. And so part of that is I have to at least have some kind of bearing. If I have a student come in and they go, "Oh, have you ever played an Eastman horn?" And I think, "I never heard of that," then that's like, that's, in my opinion, that's me not being aware enough about the industry, about the market, in
right.
terms of being able with that. So I liked it. I think it's a good saxophone. The only thing I wonder, and maybe you can kind of speak to this with some of your experiences too. The only kind of reservation I have with um, horns that are coming out of, and I think Eastman is a Taiwanese made horn, is that I've heard that I'm not sure actually if it says, Um,
Let's see. I don't because usually it will say right on the instrument, "Made in Taiwan."
yeah,
Actually, to my knowledge, that's like a legal, may even be a legal
yeah, I'm
thing.
not sure.
I mean, my other horns that are made in Taiwan say "Made in Taiwan" on them. This I
Yeah,
don't. This doesn't say.
and I've just heard things about the repairability and the longevity that are not as good as what we would consider to be a marquee brand like Yamaha or Selmer.
Hmm.
Um, and that's not necessarily a comment on their quality. And it's just one of those things
It's more
where
about
I
resale.
think there's an element of that. What? Sorry, say it again.
It's more about resale.
Yeah, and maybe longevity. I think we have a little bit of a um like a very high standard in saxophone because we play an instrument that is all metal. It and is certainly the most modern wind instrument in terms of design. That we get this, there's an expectation that it should last, an incredibly long time. Whereas I think of like a wooden instrument would have a life, would have like there's an element of that kind of thing, and I think, it's not totally unheard of to have people who are like, oh yeah, this is my, 1920s Conberry sax that's 100
Right.
years old, and I have an expectation that I'm going to go play this on a gig and it's going to hold up and I'm going to be able to use it all the time. And I think other instruments don't have that expectation. And I even think about that with me. My tenor is from the early, made in Paris in the early 1960s. Um, and genuinely, my expectation, and I don't think it would be totally off base, is that I could play that saxophone for the rest of my life.
Mm.
And so I think so sometimes when people talk about this, and I think what they're saying are valid, but I think we have this expectation like, oh, the saxophone is going to, last the rest of your life. Um, that's a pretty high burden to put on an instrument. And I also think kind of what you were talking about, alluding to before, there might be a negativity to that, right? Because if I'm going to play, I bought my tenor in 2010, and it kind of, and it was old then, right? It was made in 1962, 63. I would expect that these companies are innovating since then.
Yeah. Right.
So
Right. Right.
you know what I mean?
So
So it kind of turns into, it's like, well, do I want that to last? But I have heard that, but I don't know about Eastman specifically.
so the model of this horn is actually Rue Saint George. Rue Saint George.
Yeah. Okay.
That's the actual model of this. And so the Andreas Eastman, apparently that's the sort of that's just like the company name. Um,
Yeah.
one other thing I wanted to say before I forgot is the stack on the right hand, the palm stack,
Hmm.
is the keys are quite a bit shaped. Like
Mm.
um, the E key, you know, the E key is kind of flatter, has like a flatter shape than
Mm.
the other two. Um, the other two are a little more of like kind of like a beveled. They have like a um, oblong is not the right thing, but it's kind of a beveled sort of shape to them. And the E key is a little flatter, which feels pretty natural as far as like where your
Yeah.
hand tends to touch those keys. The side C key, for instance, is just a tiny bit higher, just a tiny bit in the
Oh, interesting.
bevel, just a tiny bit higher, which actually makes it pretty comfortable. So it's pretty, yeah. You said something about the F sharp key as far as the spring tension, and this was
Yeah.
like a setup thing that you were saying. So it seems to me like that F sharp key is like the spring is a little stronger than the F in the what am I going to call that, in the D key, right?
Yeah.
Um, it's a little bit more tension there, but that is kind of we're sort of splitting hairs there, and all that would that would take is probably just to make that spring just a little weaker. That's pretty easy to do.
Yeah, and I think of behind any great horn is a really great repair tech, and so
Oh
that's
yeah, right.
easy stuff for a professional to kind of help you with
also,
setup and stuff like that.
also this the forked F key um, has a. I mean, all of my horns now have this, except for I've got a 70,000 series Mark 6 alto. It has a button up there, right? But all the
Hmm.
rest of the horns that I have, well, that's not true either. I mean, I've got a Marigold uh, alto, King Marigold, and then I've got a the horn I started on, which is like a 1920s con alto. Um,
Oh, okay.
um, uh, but yeah, they have buttons. But
Hmm.
all the modern horns that I actually play, they all have this sort
Yeah,
of, instead of having the button, they have those sort of lever. Um,
yeah, the
but
teardrop. Yeah,
yeah, but this lever has kind of a different shape to it than the other ones do. Like I've seen them where it'll have like a teardrop, but it'll be like a symmetrical teardrop on most of them.
uh,
Like it's shaped the same. This is not shaped the same on both sides. On one side of
oh,
it, almost the side where your fingers gripping, it it has more of like an indentation than the other side, which is you don't touch the other side anyway. So it's
yeah,
so that's kind of interesting. Um, but I'm impressed with the horn. I mean, I played it a little bit in studio class today, and our students played it also. They seem to enjoy it. Um, seems like as far as range, I noticed that especially playing up in the altissimo range, it was very free and was not fighting me for those notes to come out. Um,
yeah,
even with the
same.
partially chipped reed, was not fighting me too hard. So Um, and and then the last thing I wanted us to talk about, and you started talking about it, is just this whole viability of new technology.
Mm.
You know, so I remember. So what was it? The Series 3 Soprano, the Selmer Series 3 Soprano. I remember when that first came out, and it was said that the soprano that they had gone too far with some of the ways that they had gone too far with fixing some of the issues with the saxophone, and so they believed that that saxophone was probably not going to sell very well. Uh, it seems to me that maybe it doesn't sell as well as maybe the Series Two, or has sold as well as the Series Two, but it still seems to me like a lot of people like the Series Three. Uh, Series Three horns. But that brings up just this idea of like what is too far. Like, what are you actually
Yeah.
allowed to fix about the saxophone, and actually have people actually come and buy the saxophone from you? So, the intonation thing is interesting. So much of the playing the saxophone is about voicing because we sort of have accepted that the instrument doesn't play in tune. It's not really
Hmm.
it's not really in tune with itself. It's not really in tune with anyone else. So all of the adjustments are all voicing. And so the thing is that is you're developing muscle memory. So if you're developing muscle memory based on something that is inherently out of tune, and then somebody hands to you, hey, play this horn perfectly balanced and in tune, and then you don't have to do all that voicing, you're going to have to basically, it's like learning a new instrument.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, and it's kind of what
what
I
do you
was
think of
saying
that?
before, that there's a balance of uh that sometimes my immediate reaction to something being different is that it is bad.
Right.
And that's a bias I think you kind of want to be, if nothing else, just aware of. um but yeah, but I agree. I think there's probably other innovations and stuff that uh, you might perceive as a negative thing because you're used to something or because it doesn't match up with your current equipment, right? There's always this balance and kind of the never ending cycle of, oh, I got a new saxophone. So maybe I could look at mouthpieces now. Oh, I got a new mouthpiece. So maybe I could look at this. And then so oh, it's
Yeah.
like when I start changing that stuff, then I might cause me to readjust, rebalance what I'm doing. And I think that can lead you to a little bit of like a, like a never ending cycle. Um, and so I wonder if there's an element of that where it's like, oh, well, there's things that are good about this instrument, but my setup, for lack of a better term, is designed for an old system and maybe it's less compatible. And so immediately it feels worse. And there's certain times where, in saxophone equipment and life, you kind of have to go through something that maybe feels like a step back in order to allow you to take steps forward. And I think this is totally true for some musicians, and I mean this, I mean this negatively. That can be a big ask, right? If I'm on tour, or if I'm, if I gig full time for my living, and I can't take the next couple of weeks to relearn this because I got a gig
Yeah.
tonight and it has to be good. You know what I mean? And so there absolutely are instances where it's like, no, 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 I need something that works for me right now and I don't have the ability to invest that. And I think there's an element of that for people like us as full-time, collegiate educators, that we have a little bit more of that flexibility where you can get this horn and go, yeah, let me screw around, with this alto for a little while. And part of that is your ability level, but also part of that is, I'm not gigging necessarily as my full job. And so I have the ability to have a little bit more flexibility. And then obviously there's a cost element. There's a lot of things that can kind of go into that. But I think it's important to continue to grow and evolve the instrument. And certainly there are a lot of innovations that are coming out. That's kind of, you know, for me, I think we talked about this last time for reeds and equipment. I spent a long time with some of my teachers where the mentality was it's effectively, a Selmer Mark 6 is a perfect saxophone and you're wrong. Effectively, and it's your fault that it's not sounding in a certain way or not playing in tune. And I really had that mentality for a long time. And so it led me to not try synthetic reeds, to not look at different necks. That was a big thing. My teacher in grad school is a fantastic saxophone player, really an incredible, just, the physicality of controlling the instrument is really incredible. Um, but, I would talk about different things, even like the neck mask stuff that we talked about. And it would be, well, the saxophone is made right. And so it kind of discouraged me from trying that stuff. And so really, kind of, I guess, post pandemic for me, it's been, you know, let's check it out. Let's see. Let's try to be unbiased. Let's try to understand, and use, kind of like I said before, use the position that we're in as educators to, oh, I can mess around with these reads for a couple weeks and it's not gonna, like put me in a position where I'm not going to get calls anymore or something like that, or instruments or whatever else. And I think it can only lead you, uh, at the very least, to be more educated, and at best can lead you to something that is ultimately greater, in terms of what you're able to achieve. So,
Yeah, yeah. And this is it's an interesting point. Now, the reason that I went over to we were at the Gen conference. That's when I met with the Eastman folks, and they knew who I was when I walked over there. Doctor Thunder, Doctor Thunder. I thought that was funny, and it's because Danny Janklow, shout out to Danny, had sent an email to connect us, and so anyhow we I came over there, and the reason I walked over there was really specifically because I was thinking about a classical alto. I want
yeah,
something that for that lane. I want something that feels different, plays different, is different, and the tolerance for playing that music is there's less tolerance. I mean, you have to you I mean, it really has to play a certain way. And one thing that's interesting about this horn, and then I think we can probably call it for today's show,
Sure.
is it has two different necks. It has an R neck and an S neck. And the S neck is this more free blowing, flexible sort of neck, and the R neck is this. It's almost like R for restricted. It is. Uh, dare I say more focused? I don't. I almost don't like that term because focus sometimes, or a lack of focus, or whatever, that can sort of be pejorative.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot in between classical and jazz. People will describe a classical sound as being more focused air and more focused like this. Well, I don't know that I'd describe it that way. I just say it's different. It's just different air.
Yeah.
I certainly
Hmm.
have a particular target when I'm playing jazz, as far as the
Yeah.
quality of the air, and it is consistent air. It's not like sometimes it's this and sometimes it's that. It's still hitting the same target. I'm just not trying to hit the target that you're hitting when you're playing classical saxophone. So that's a different thing. But the R neck sort of imposes that more classical approach, that higher pitch coming out of the mouthpiece, which I think
Hmm.
is interesting. And I wonder if, when I get more time to spend with the horn, especially on the classical side of the horn, if that's going to be something that makes it less challenging for me to sort of switch from my sort of jazz
Oh,
approach to the classical approach. If I'm actually playing on a neck that makes me do that, mouthpiece that makes me do that, I'm playing on a different horn, X, Y, and Z. So anyhow, so the jury's still kind of out, but the my initial thoughts about the horn is it's great, um, and yeah, that's it.
yeah. I think it's kind of a good thing to kind of be wary of because I'm sure you've had experiences. I know I have where I play an instrument and I know right away. I play a
Yeah,
scale. Cool. I don't need to play that again. So even just the ability of let me keep playing this. Let me try that one more time is exciting because it means at least there's something there. And as you adjust and learn more about the instrument, kind of what we were talking about before, maybe it allows me to take a greater step. So it's cool. I'm excited to see what kind of more about what you think on it in the coming weeks. So
all right, man. Well, I guess it's that time. We'll reconvene next week for another Tenor Talks. And folks, make sure you go back through and check out the first two episodes. Like, share, comment, subscribe, become a channel member where you'll get access to all archived videos. Uh, yeah, support the show. Uh, you can support by subscribing. You can support by watching old episodes, liking the video, all of that good stuff. Cash App, Venmo, PayPal, Dr. Thunder Music, all one word. Spell out the word doctor. And that's our time. See y'all later. Peace.